Miguel woke up to the familiar sound of chaos outside his window. His neighborhood, a crammed collection of shacks and crumbling buildings, was already alive with people shouting, horns honking, and the distant hum of motorcycles. It was the same every morning in the favela. Today, like most days, Miguel felt the sharp pang of hunger gnawing at his stomach. He turned on his side, trying to ignore it. His mother had already left for work, cleaning offices in the city. She'd come home late, exhausted after a long day, while Miguel would spend most of his time looking after his two younger brothers. He wished he could help more, but at 12 years old, he wasn't old enough to get a job, at least not a legal one. And even though he wanted to, his mom always told him to focus on school. Education is your way out, she'd say, though Miguel wasn't so sure. The hunger and the endless struggle to survive made it hard to think about the future. There was one thing, though, that made him forget about the weight of poverty: football. Every afternoon, once he finished with his brothers and the little homework he could manage, he'd head to the small dirt field near the edge of the favela. There, barefoot and with an old patched-up ball, Miguel could dream. In those moments, when the ball was at his feet, the world faded away. For a little while, he could pretend that he was someone else, somewhere else. His friends teased him, saying he thought he'd be the next Pele or Neymar. But for Miguel, football was more than just a game. It was an escape from the reality of the favela, away from the noise, the hunger, and the tension. His mother often reminded him that football wouldn't put food on the table, but Miguel didn't care. He held on to the hope that one day maybe it could. School wasn't much of a reprieve. While Miguel had always been a decent student, the constant teasing wore him down. The other kids, especially those who came from better-off families, loved to mock him for his torn clothes and patched-up shoes. "Favela boy," they'd call him. "When are you going to stop pretending you'll make it out?" Miguel ignored them, at least outwardly. Inside, the words stung. He knew they saw him as nothing more than another poor kid from the slums, destined to stay trapped in the same cycle of poverty, just like his father had been. Before his father disappeared, Miguel had heard the same kind of hopeless talk. And now, with him gone, there wasn't much keeping Miguel from following the same path. But football made him feel different. It gave him purpose. On the pitch, no one cared about his clothes, his home, or the fact that he sometimes went to bed hungry. All that mattered was what he could do with the ball, and Miguel could do a lot. One day, as he was walking home from school, still feeling the sting of the day's insults, he spotted a group of older boys gathered around a street corner. They were talking and laughing, but something about the way they stood, leaning against the wall, made Miguel uneasy. He recognized some of them from the neighborhood, boys who had dropped out of school to work for the local gang. They were always around, always offering an easy way out. The money was tempting. Miguel knew his mother was struggling to keep food on the table, and some days he was tempted to take the same path as the older boys. As he passed, one of them, Jeffinho, called out to him, "Hey Miguel, you're pretty good with that ball. Why not come make some real money? We could use someone like you." Miguel shook his head, quickening his pace. "Nah, man, I'm good," Jeffinho laughed. "Suit yourself, but don't wait too long. Your family could eat tonight if you play for our team." The words hung in the air as Miguel walked away, but deep down they echoed. The temptation was always there, just a breath away. By the time he reached home, the sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows over the narrow streets. His brothers were playing with sticks in the corner, and the house was quiet, empty of his mother's presence. Miguel sighed, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He knew the older boys were trouble, but their offer lingered in his mind, pulling at the edges of his resolve. As much as he hated it, part of him wondered how long he could keep saying no. That night, as he lay on the thin mattress he shared with his brothers, Miguel thought about the football field, about the freedom it gave him. But he also thought about Jeffinho's words, about the money that could change everything. His stomach growled, the hunger making it impossible to sleep. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd head to the field, kick the ball around, and forget all of this. Tomorrow, things would be different. The next day started like any other. Miguel woke up before the sun, careful not to disturb his younger brothers as he got ready for school. His stomach still felt empty, but that was nothing new. He grabbed the last piece of bread his mother had left for him the night before and shoved it into his mouth before heading out. The familiar walk through the winding streets of the favela brought him past the same faces. People he'd grown up with. Neighbors who were just as trapped in this place as he was. As Miguel approached the school gates, his mood shifted. He could already hear the laughter of the other kids inside. The ones who always seemed to have new shoes, clean clothes, and plenty to eat. They'd never understand what it was like for him. Every day felt like a battle, not just against hunger, but against the constant reminder that he didn't belong. In class, things were no different. The usual crowd of boys waited for him, leaning against the wall like they owned the place. As soon as Miguel entered, the jeers started. "Hey, favela boy! Still wearing those same shoes? Maybe if you're lucky, someone will toss you a new pair," one of them yelled, his voice dripping with mockery. Miguel clenched his fists, his face hot with anger, but he didn't say anything. He had learned that speaking up only made things worse. He lowered his head and took his seat, trying to block out the laughter and focus on the lessons. But it was hard to concentrate when all he could think about was the gnawing emptiness in his stomach and the voices reminding him that no matter how hard he tried, he'd always be the poor kid. At recess, Miguel found his usual spot near the fence at the edge of the playground. He watched the others play football, his fingers itching to join in. But he knew that if he tried, they'd just laugh him off the field. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because they didn't want someone like him around. "Hey, Miguel!" A voice broke through his thoughts, and he looked up to see Leo, one of the boys from his class. Unlike the others, Leo wasn't rich, but he wasn't poor either. He hovered somewhere in the middle, always friendly enough, but distant. "You're still coming to the game this weekend, right? We could use someone who actually knows how to play," Leo said, tossing a ball up and down in his hands. Miguel hesitated. He wanted to play, but he also knew what it meant. Playing in front of the others would put a target on his back. They'd expect him to fail and make fun of him if he didn't live up to their standards. But the chance to touch the ball, to feel the rush of the game again, was too tempting. "Yeah, I'll be there," Miguel said, trying to sound confident. Leo grinned. "Great. We'll need all the help we can get." As the day wore on, the teasing didn't let up, but Miguel held on to the promise of the weekend game. It was something to look forward to, something that made the insults a little more bearable. But as soon as school let out, Miguel's optimism began to fade. Walking back home through the favela, the tension in the air was thicker than usual. He noticed a few of the older boys from the gang hanging out on the same corner as before, their eyes following him as he passed. Jafino was there again, leaning against the wall with a cigarette in hand, a smirk on his face. "Yo, Miguel!" Jafino called out, stepping forward and blocking Miguel's path. "Heard you're trying to play with the rich kids now. Think you're better than us?" Miguel kept his gaze low, avoiding eye contact. "Just playing football, man, that's all." Jafino's smirk widened. "Just football, huh? Well, we've got a game too. You could make some real money if you played for us. You know, help your family out." Miguel swallowed hard, his mind flashing to the near-empty fridge at home, to his mother's tired face and his brother's constant hunger. It wasn't the first time Jeffinho had offered him money, and every time it got harder to say no. The temptation clawed at him, especially now that he knew how desperate things were getting at home. "You don't have to decide right now," Jeffinho said, as if reading his thoughts. "Just think about it. You know where to find us." Miguel nodded slightly before walking away, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. The money Jeffinho promised wasn't just an idea anymore. It was starting to feel like a necessity. His family needed help, and no one was offering him anything better. That night, sitting at the small kitchen table with his brothers, Miguel couldn't stop thinking about Jeffinho's words. The pressure was getting to him. He wanted to help his mother, to make things easier for her. Every time he looked at his brothers, their innocent faces unaware of the full weight of their situation, he felt a pang of guilt. Shouldn't he do whatever it took to protect them? But then there was football. The one thing that made him feel like he was more than just another poor kid from the favela. The game gave him hope, a reason to believe that maybe he could escape this life. The thought of giving that up, of becoming another face in the gang, terrified him. But was it enough? Was a dream really worth the sacrifice when his family was suffering? His mother came home late that night, her face pale and tired. She barely had the energy to greet him before collapsing onto her bed. Miguel watched her, feeling the weight of his decisions pressing down on him harder than ever. He needed to do something, But what? The streets or the pitch? The easy money or the dream that still felt so far away? The weekend arrived, and with it, the game Miguel had been thinking about all week. Despite the weight of Jafinho's offer hanging over him, he couldn't ignore the thrill that came with stepping onto a pitch, even if it was just a schoolyard game. The other boys from his class were already there when he arrived, kicking the ball around and warming up. Leo waved him over as soon as he saw him. A grin spread wide across his face. "Glad you made it," Leo said, passing the ball to Miguel. Miguel smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept drifting back to Jafinho's offer. The money, the possibility of helping his family, it all weighed on him like a dark cloud. But for now, he tried to push it aside. This was his chance to show what he could do. As the game began, it didn't take long for Miguel to find his rhythm. The ball seemed to stick to his feet, as if it were an extension of him. He weaved through defenders, his instincts sharp and his movements quick. The other boys, who'd been skeptical of him at first, couldn't deny his skill. Even Leo, who was usually one of the better players, found himself chasing after Miguel more than once. Halfway through the game, something unexpected happened. A man stood near the edge of the field, watching intently. He was older, maybe in his 40s, dressed casually but with an air of authority about him. Miguel noticed him out of the corner of his eye but didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for people to stop and watch kids play football in the neighborhood. But this man wasn't just any onlooker. After the game ended, as Miguel was catching his breath, the man approached him. "You've got real talent, kid," he said, his voice steady and confident. Miguel, still panting from the game, looked up in surprise. "Thanks," he muttered, unsure of what to say. The man smiled. "Name's Paulo. I'm a scout for a local football club. I saw the way you moved out there, natural, fast, and smart. You ever thought about taking this seriously? Playing for a team?" Miguel's heart raced. This was it. This was what he'd been dreaming about for years, ever since he first kicked a ball. An opportunity to play for a real club. But at the same time, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Things like this didn't happen to kids like him. I don't know," Miguel stammered. "I mean, yeah, I love football, but I don't know if I can—" Paulo cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Listen, I know what it's like. I grew up in a place not so different from here. I've seen a lot of kids with potential, but not many have the drive. You do. I can see it. I can get you a tryout with the club's youth team. No guarantees, but if you play like you did today, I think you'll have a shot." Miguel stood there stunned. A tryout at a real club? It felt too good to be true. Paulo handed him a card with the club's name and address. "The tryout's next weekend. Be there. And don't let this chance slip away." Miguel nodded, clutching the card tightly in his hand as Paulo walked away. His mind was spinning. This was the kind of opportunity that could change everything, not just for him, but for his whole family. If he could make it into the club, he could eventually earn money, help his mom, and maybe, just maybe, escape the favela for good. But as Miguel started walking home, reality began to creep back in. The tryout was in the city, a long way from where he lived. He didn't have money for the bus fare, let alone for proper gear to wear at the tryout. His mother was already stretched thin, working long hours just to keep them fed. How could he possibly ask her for money to chase what she considered a pipe dream? When he got home, the small, cramped house was quiet. His brothers were playing outside, and his mother was still at work. Miguel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the card Paulo had given him. It felt like the key to another world, a world where he wasn't constantly hungry or worried about the future. But getting there was the problem. Later that evening, his mother finally returned home, her face pale and drawn from exhaustion. Miguel hesitated, unsure if he should tell her about the tryout. She always told him that football wouldn't change anything, that it was just a game, not a way out. But this was different. This wasn't just playing in the streets. This was a real chance. "Mom," Miguel started, his voice hesitant. I got offered a tryout for a football club." His mother looked at him, tired but curious. "A tryout?" "Yeah, a scout saw me playing today. He said I have potential, but it's next weekend and I'd need money to get there." She sighed, her shoulders sagging. "Miguel, I know you love football, but we don't have money for things like that. We barely have enough for food, you know that." "I know," Miguel said quickly. "But this could be different. If I make it, I could help us. His mother rubbed her eyes, clearly worn down by the weight of their situation. I don't want you getting your hopes up for something that might not happen. We need to focus on what's real, what's right in front of us. Miguel's heart sank. He understood her reluctance, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. She didn't believe that football could change anything for them, but he did. Okay, Mom, he said softly, not wanting to push her any further. That night, as Miguel lay in bed, the card still clutched in his hand, he thought about everything that had happened. The tryout felt like a lifeline, a way out of the life he was trapped in. But without the money to get there, it might as well have been a million miles away. The week leading up to the tryout felt like a blur. Miguel couldn't think of anything else. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw himself on the field, proving his worth to the coaches. His name being called out for the team. It was a dream so close he could almost taste it. But the looming question of how to get there, both physically and emotionally, hung over him like a storm cloud. He had tried to save money, doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, but it wasn't enough. Every coin he earned went toward food for his brothers, or small things his mother needed. By Friday, he was no closer to affording the bus fare than he had been at the start of the week. Desperation began to sink in, and for the first time, Jafinho's words started to make sense. He didn't want to give in to the gang, but what other choice did he have? That evening, as the sun began to set and the streets of the favela took on their usual chaos, Miguel made the decision to find Jafinho. If he could just do one job, nothing major, just enough to get the money for the bus, he could walk away from it after. One job and he'd never have to deal with the gang again. The air was thick with tension as Miguel walked through the narrow alleys, heading toward the spot where Jafinho and the other boys usually hung out. He told himself over and over that this was the right thing to do, that it was for his family, for his future. But deep down, he knew that once you got involved, it was hard to get out. Before he could reach the corner, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Miguel froze. The distant rumble of police cars rolling into the favela was familiar, but it always brought an unsettling feeling. The cops didn't come here to protect people. They came to crack down, to assert their power, and it never ended well for anyone caught in their path. Suddenly, the street exploded into chaos. People ran in all directions as police vans sped into the neighborhood, officers jumping out with batons and shields. It was a raid. Miguel turned to run, but before he could move, a cop grabbed him from behind, slamming him against the wall. "Stop right there," the officer barked, his grip tightening on Miguel's arm. "I didn't do anything," Miguel shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. But the cop didn't care. To him, Miguel was just another kid from the favela, just another potential criminal. The officer shoved him harder against the wall, twisting his arm behind his back as he patted him down roughly. "What you got on you?" the cop demanded. "Nothing, I swear, I'm just—" The words were knocked out of him as the cop pressed his elbow into Miguel's back, forcing him down onto the ground. Pain shot through his body, but all he could think about was how this was it. This was how people ended up getting dragged into the system, labeled as criminals when they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. A crowd had gathered, watching from the shadows. No one dared step in. They knew better. The police did what they wanted here, and no one ever questioned it. Miguel's face was pressed against the rough concrete as the cop continued to search him. His mind raced. All he could think about was his family, his mother, who worked herself to exhaustion every day, and his brothers, who relied on him to stay out of trouble. He couldn't get arrested. He couldn't let this happen. Another officer came over, looking down at Miguel with disdain. "What's this one? Caught him running?" "Looks like it," the first cop replied, yanking Miguel up by his shirt and shoving him toward the police van. "Probably up to no good." "I wasn't running," Miguel gasped, struggling to breathe. "I didn't do anything wrong." But it didn't matter. They didn't care. In their eyes, he was guilty just by being there, just by being from this place. The ride to the police station was a blur of fear and anger. Miguel sat in the back of the van, his wrists bound with rough zip ties, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. How could he explain this to his mother? How could he explain it to anyone? Hours passed in the holding cell, surrounded by other boys, some his age, some older, all looking just as lost and afraid as he felt. He tried to keep his head down, but the voices around him were loud. filled with stories of raids like this, of lives derailed by a single night of bad luck. Eventually, a guard called his name, and Miguel was released. No charges, no explanation. Just another kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, sent back out into the streets like nothing had happened. When Miguel walked back into the favela, the sky was starting to lighten with the first signs of dawn. He felt numb, his body sore from the rough handling, but it was the weight in his chest that hurt the most, the fear, the helplessness. It was like a cage around his heart, trapping him in a reality he had no control over. This was what it meant to be from the favela, to be seen as guilty without ever doing anything wrong. His mother was waiting for him when he got home, her face pale with worry. She had heard about the raid, about the boys who had been taken. The look in her eyes when she saw him, the relief mixed with fear, made his throat tighten. "Miguel, where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He wanted to tell her the truth, to explain everything, but he couldn't. He didn't want to add to her worries. Instead, he just shook his head. "Nowhere, I'm fine." But he wasn't. Not really. Something had changed that night. The dream of football, of getting out, felt more distant than ever. How could he ever hope to escape when the world saw him as nothing more than a criminal waiting to happen? Miguel lay in bed that morning, staring at the ceiling as the sounds of the favela carried on outside. He had always known that life here was hard, that the odds were stacked against him. But now, after what had happened, it felt like those odds were impossible to beat. The next few days passed in a haze. Miguel moved through them like a shadow of himself, haunted by what had happened during the raid. The fear, the helplessness, it all sat heavy in his chest. His dreams of football seemed to slip further and further away, like something he could see but never touch. He still had Paulo's card, tucked safely in his pocket, but the thought of showing up for the tryout now felt almost impossible. His mother had been quieter since the raid, her usual exhaustion replaced by a deeper worry that she tried to hide. Miguel could see it in her eyes whenever she looked at him. He knew she was afraid that the next time he wouldn't come home at all. And part of him shared that fear. How many kids had he seen taken by the system, labeled as troublemakers just because of where they came from? What was stopping that from happening to him? One night, as Miguel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the few coins he'd managed to save, his mother came and sat beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him, with that same tired look in her eyes. "Miguel," she said softly, "I know things are hard right now. I know it feels like the world is against you." Miguel didn't say anything, his fingers tracing the edges of Paulo's card. "But you're smart. You've always been smart. You're not like the others who get pulled into things they can't control. You have a chance to do something different, something better." He looked up at her, surprised. She had never really encouraged his football dream before. To her, it had always seemed like just that, a dream. But now there was something in her voice that gave him hope. "I know you want to go to that tryout," she continued, nodding toward the card in his hand. "I've seen how much you love football, and I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like it wasn't important. I just don't want you to get hurt. I don't want to see you crushed if it doesn't work out." Miguel swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "What if it's my only way out, Mom? What if football's the only chance we have?" She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I want you to try. I want you to go for it. But I need you to be careful. This world, it's not kind to boys like you. You have to be stronger than all of it." Miguel nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. He understood what she was saying. The world wasn't fair, and the road ahead would be harder than most. But he had to try. If he didn't, he'd never know what could have been. The next morning, with his mother's quiet encouragement, Miguel made his decision. He would go to the tryout, no matter what. But he still needed money to get there. That was the problem that had been looming over him since the beginning, and he had no solution. Jafinho's offer, the one he had been trying to push to the back of his mind, resurfaced. The gang had the money he needed, and they'd give it to him if he agreed to do just one job. He had told himself before that he wouldn't go down that path, that he could find another way. But with the tryout approaching fast, desperation was starting to creep in. The next time Miguel saw Jafinho, the conversation was brief. "Thought about what I said?" Jafinho asked, leaning against the wall with his usual smirk. Miguel hesitated for just a second before nodding. "I'll do it. Just one job. That's it." Jaffinho's grin widened. "I knew you'd come around." Miguel didn't meet his eyes. This wasn't a victory for him. It felt more like a defeat, but he had no other choice. The money he'd get from doing the job would be enough to get him to the tryout, and after that, he told himself, he'd be done with the gang. But deep down, Miguel knew it wasn't that simple. Once you stepped into that world, it was hard to leave. The streets didn't let you go so easily. With the deal made, Miguel walked away, the cash in his pocket feeling heavier than it should have. His mind was filled with conflicting thoughts, excitement about the tryout, guilt about what he had agreed to do, and fear of what might come next. The line between right and wrong had never felt so blurred. That night, Miguel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. He had made his choice, and now there was no going back. All he could do was hope that it would be worth it, that the dream of football could outweigh the reality of the streets. The day of the tryout finally arrived, and Miguel woke up with his heart pounding. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with excitement and anxiety. After all the uncertainty, all the struggles, here it was, the chance to prove himself. But beneath the excitement, there was something else, a feeling of guilt about the deal he'd made with Jaffinho. He had done the job, and now he had the money, but it didn't sit right with him. He kept telling himself that it was just one time, that it was over. But deep down, he knew it was never that simple. Miguel tucked the cash into his pocket, enough to cover the bus fare and a little extra. He grabbed his worn-out football shoes, the ones with peeling soles and frayed laces, and headed out. His mother wished him luck, giving him a tight hug before he left. Her eyes held the same mixture of hope and fear that Miguel felt inside. The bus ride into the city felt longer than usual. As the tall buildings of the city skyline came into view, Miguel's nerves began to set in. This wasn't the dusty field in the favela. This was a real club, with real players, and he knew the competition would be fierce. But he had to push those thoughts away. He had to believe that he belonged there, even if everything around him told him otherwise. When he arrived at the club, the sheer size of the place took his breath away. The fields were immaculate, with perfectly trimmed grass and white chalk lines that stretched out like something from a dream. It was a world away from the patchy, dirt-streaked field back home. As Miguel made his way to the registration table, he couldn't help but notice the stares. The other boys, most of them wearing expensive gear, were whispering and pointing at him. His clothes were old and worn, and his shoes, though functional, were clearly past their prime. It didn't matter that he had the same talent. Here, appearances seemed to speak louder than anything else. He could hear the murmurs as he passed by. Look at his shoes. How does he expect to play in those? Where'd he come from? The streets? Miguel kept his head down, refusing to let their words get to him. He was used to this by now. In the favela, people judged him for being poor, and out here, it was the same story. But none of that mattered once the game started. Once he had the ball at his feet, everything else disappeared. He handed over his name at the registration desk, and after a short wait, it was his turn to play. The coaches stood on the sidelines, clipboards in hand, watching as the boys ran drills and scrimmages. Miguel's heart raced as he stepped onto the field. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The other boys on the field were fast, sharp, and clearly well-trained. They moved like they had been playing together for years. Miguel, however, was used to playing by instinct, to finding openings where none existed. He knew how to read the game in a way that only the streets could teach. And once he got going, it didn't take long for him to find his rhythm. With the ball at his feet, he danced around the defenders, cutting inside with precision and speed. He could feel the eyes of the coaches on him, watching, evaluating. And for a moment, he forgot about everything. The guilt, the stares, the pressure. It was just him and the game. But it didn't take long for the whispers to start again, this time from some of the boys on the field. "Hey, favela boy, you think you belong here?" One of them sneered as Miguel dribbled past. "Yeah, maybe you should go back to where you came from," another boy added, shoving Miguel off the ball with more force than necessary. Miguel stumbled but quickly regained his balance. His heart pounded in his chest, not from exhaustion but from the anger building inside him. He wanted to shout back, to tell them they didn't know anything about him, but he couldn't let that get to him now. He had come too far for this. As the scrimmage continued, the tension between Miguel and the other boys only grew. Every time he got the ball, they seemed more aggressive, more determined to knock him down. And while the coaches didn't say anything, Miguel could feel the weight of their judgment. He didn't need to hear their words to know what they were thinking. They saw him as a risk, as someone who didn't fit into their polished, controlled world. When the final whistle blew, Miguel's chest heaved with exhaustion. He had given everything he had on the field, despite the obstacles. The coaches gathered the boys together, calling out a few names to stay behind for further evaluation. Miguel's heart raced as he waited, holding his breath. But when the names were called, his wasn't among them. Miguel's stomach dropped. He stood there frozen as the selected boys jogged over to the coaches, their faces glowing with excitement. He had come all this way, fought through every obstacle, and it still hadn't been enough. As he turned to leave, one of the assistant coaches caught up with him. "Hey kid," the coach said, his voice low. "You've got talent, no doubt about it. But this club, it's tough. They don't take risks on kids they think might cause problems down the line." Miguel looked up at the coach, confused. "What do you mean?" The coach hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the other boys. "They're looking for players who fit a certain mold. And kids from your background, well, let's just say they're not what this club is usually looking for." Miguel clenched his fists, the meaning behind the coach's words hitting him hard. It wasn't about his talent. It was about where he came from, about the assumptions they made the moment they saw him. He had been judged before he even stepped onto the field. The coach offered a sympathetic smile. "Keep your head up, all right? Don't let this stop you." But as Miguel walked away from the field, the words felt hollow. He had done everything he could, but it still wasn't enough. The bus ride back to the favela felt endless. Miguel sat in silence, his fingers tightly gripping the torn seat in front of him. He replayed the tryout in his mind over and over, trying to figure out what he could have done differently. He had played his heart out, pushed through the insults, and showed his skills. But it didn't matter. In the end, they hadn't chosen him. And it wasn't because he wasn't good enough. It was because of where he came from. As the bus rattled down the bumpy streets, Miguel stared out the window, his reflection barely visible in the glass. The city slowly disappeared behind him, replaced by the familiar sight of the favela's crowded alleys and stacked houses. The weight of the rejection sat heavily on his chest. This tryout had felt like his one shot, and now it was gone. When the bus finally stopped, Miguel stepped out into the fading light of the evening. He walked home slowly, his feet dragging with exhaustion, not just from the day, but from everything. His mother was waiting for him when he arrived, her eyes filled with the same question he had been asking himself. How did it go? Miguel shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. He didn't want to see the disappointment in her face, the same disappointment he felt in himself. His mother, sensing his mood, didn't press him for details. Instead, she wrapped him in a hug, holding him close like she had when he was a little boy. "I'm proud of you, Miguel," she whispered, "no matter what." Her words were kind, but they didn't ease the ache in his heart. He had wanted to bring her good news, to tell her that things were going to change. Instead, he had nothing to offer. As the night settled in, Miguel lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to shake the feeling of failure. But sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, Miguel woke to the sounds of the favela coming alive around him. Life moved on, as it always did. The streets buzzed with activity, the vendors calling out their goods, kids laughing and playing, and the distant rumble of motorcycles echoing through the alleys. But Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that he was stuck, like nothing had changed, despite everything he had been through. Later that day, as Miguel wandered through the neighborhood, he ran into Jefino again. The older boy was lounging with his usual crew, their laughter cutting through the noise of the streets. Jefino spotted Miguel and waved him over with a grin. "Hey Miguel, heard you went to that fancy tryout. How'd it go, huh? You signed that contract yet?" Miguel's jaw tightened. He didn't want to talk about it, but he knew Jefino wasn't going to let it go. "They didn't pick me," Miguel muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. Jafino's grin faded slightly, but his eyes gleamed with something that Miguel didn't like. "Well, what did I tell you? Those rich guys don't care about kids like us. They only care about their own. You think they want to let someone from the favela onto their team? Nah, man. You should have listened to me. You could be rolling in cash by now if you'd just taken my offer." Miguel stared at him, the frustration building in his chest. Jafino's words echoed what the assistant coach had said. The system wasn't made for kids like him. It was made to keep them out. But as tempting as Jafino's offer was, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that going down that path would destroy everything he had fought for. "I'm not interested," Miguel said firmly, his voice harder than he had intended. Jafino raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "Suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when you're still stuck here in a few years, wishing you had a way out." Miguel turned and walked away, the words stinging more than he wanted to admit. But deep down, he knew that if he took Jafino's offer, he'd be stuck for good. Days passed, and despite everything, Miguel kept going back to the dirt field. The familiar patch of ground that had always been his escape now felt like the only place where he could still dream. Even if the tryout had failed, football was still the one thing that made him feel alive, that gave him hope. Then, out of nowhere, something changed. It was a sunny afternoon, and Miguel was playing with a few kids from the neighborhood when a familiar figure appeared on the edge of the field. Paulo, the scout from the tryout, stood there watching, just like he had the first time. Miguel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see Paulo again, not after how things had ended at the club. After the game ended, Paulo walked over to him, his expression serious. "Miguel," he said, "I've been thinking about what happened at the tryout. I know it didn't go the way you wanted, and I know why. It's not fair and it's not right, but you've got talent, real talent, and I'm not the only one who sees it." Miguel frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean?" "I spoke to a coach from another club," Paulo continued, his voice steady. "It's not as big as the first one, but they're looking for new players. And this coach? He doesn't care where you come from. He cares about how you play. I can get you another tryout if you're willing." Miguel blinked, his mind reeling. Another chance? After everything, there was still hope? "Why would you do this?" Miguel asked, still trying to process what was happening. Paulo smiled faintly. "Because I see myself in you. I grew up in a place like this. I know what it's like to fight for a way out, to be told you don't belong. But I made it, and I know you can too." The words hit Miguel like a wave, filling him with a sense of determination he hadn't felt since before the first tryout. Maybe the system wasn't fair, but that didn't mean he had to accept it. He had come too far to give up now. The second tryout wasn't as glamorous as the first. The club's facilities were smaller, the field a little rougher, but Miguel didn't care. This time, it wasn't about the prestige, it was about the game. The coach watched closely as Miguel played, his eyes following every move, every touch of the ball. And this time, Miguel didn't feel the same pressure to prove himself. He just played, letting his instincts take over, letting the game speak for itself. When the tryout ended, the coach called him over, his expression thoughtful. "You've got something, kid," the coach said. "We're building a team here, and I think you could be a part of it. We'll take you on." Miguel's heart soared. It was happening. He had made it. Over the next few months, Miguel's life began to change. The club wasn't as big as the first one, but it was a start. He trained hard, putting everything he had into every practice, every game. And slowly, things started to improve for his family too. The small amount of money he earned playing for the youth team was enough to help his mother with bills, to buy food for his brothers, and to take some of the weight off her shoulders. But Miguel didn't stop there. As he began to find his footing in the world of football, he also started to give back. He remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, to be told he didn't belong. So he worked with Paulo to set up a program for kids from the favela, giving them the same chance he had been given, a chance to prove themselves regardless of where they came from. By the time Miguel was old enough to play professionally, he had become more than just a footballer. He had become a symbol of hope for his community, a reminder that no matter how many times the world tried to push you down, you could still rise. And as he stood on the pitch, ready to play his first professional game, Miguel knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning.